Now don't get me wrong, I've really enjoyed testing out ESO's newest class, the Arcanist, and I think in the hands of experienced players, the class performs pretty well in both solo and group content. But if you asked me to recommend a good class for beginners in ESO, I probably would not recommend the Arcanist at all, at least in its current form, and here's why. You see, recently I've been doing something on PTS that I don't think anybody else is doing. That's instead of testing a template Arcanist build with max champion points and gold quality gear, I wanted to test the Arcanist as a true beginner would play, starting from nothing. And I think from levels 1 to 20, you'll do absolutely fine. You can do damage with rune blades to generate crux, pop off your fate carver to melt enemies, and then you can heal up in between fights with rune mend. This gameplay loop feels good, it's fun to play, and it also looks fantastic, but the problems start to arise after around level 20 when you try to do more difficult content. I'm talking just, even public dungeons by yourself as part of the leveling process, going around getting skill points, things like that. Without strong gear sets or champion points, my baby Arcanist just ends up taking a lot of damage very quickly, and you get overwhelmed, especially when facing off against multiple enemies at once. So here's the basic problem. The Arcanist class doesn't have a good solution for early passive healing. Here's the thing, most classes in ESO have early access to heal over times or passive healing that happens automatically when they do damage. Take for example the Necromancer skill, Death Scythe, which has a burst heal and a heal over time component built into both the Stamina Morph and the Magicka Morph. Most players who level up the Necromancer can take advantage of the skill as early as level 10 and use it all the way up until endgame if they want, and the heal actually gets better the more enemies you face. Then we have the Nightblade with Swallow Soul, a single target damage skill that gives a powerful heal over time effect. Templars of course have Puncturing Sweep and a variety of ground-based area heals. Wardens have Vines and Green Lotus. Dragon Knights have Burning Embers, which is a combined dot and heal over time. And of course, Sorcerers have some of the best passive healing in the game with Critical Surge, but they can also get very early access to passive heals through the Blood Magic passive. So the whole point here is that self-healing and passive healing that you don't need to micromanage is the key to making the class work in ESO for beginners, for solo players, and for leveling up from 1 to 50, and the Arcanist just doesn't have a lot of it. It almost feels like Zos designed the class without much passive healing. I'm not sure why they would do that, and personally I think it needs to be updated. Plus, this would be really easy to change. But let's take a closer look at the DPS skill line Herald of the Tome next and see why. So skill number 1 here is called Rune Blades. This is a basic DPS skill that generates crux, so it's fine for what it does. I don't think this needs to change really. The morphs aren't super interesting, but it's fine for what it does. Second skill is Fate Carver, and this is your crux spender. Basically, it's going to do double damage if you have the maximum 3 crux stacked on your character. Personally, I think the morphs could be a little bit more interesting, but we can talk about that in a minute. Skill number 3 is called Abyssal Impact. It has 2 morphs. First is Cephaliarch's Flail. This is a stamina ability. It immobilizes enemies in front of you, gives a unique debuff called Abyssal Ink, so that's 5% increased damage. And the morph option here deals increased damage to enemies below half health, so it has basically an execute mechanic built into it. This generates crux as well. Then you have Tentacular Dread. This is actually a spender morph. This spends crux. It doesn't do the execute damage. Instead, it morphs it into a Magicka ability that deals frost damage, and you can consume your stacks of crux to increase the bonus damage, basically the debuff from Abyssal Ink, up to 11%. So while these seem decent on paper, I think this is where we could get some changes for the Arcanist class that really help, especially in terms of, beginners and solo builds. This is where we could actually put in some healing. First of all, Cephaliarch's Flail. The fact that this does execute damage does not make a lot of sense when your primary DPS skill, Fate Carver, has a long channel time, has much more raw damage, and it deals damage every 0.3 seconds. In most cases, you're not going to drop using Fate Carver for, this skill, Cephaliarch's Flail, even though it does bonus damage. So the execute here is, I think, a bit of a waste. It would be much better, I think, to put some healing onto this morph. I mean, just think about it. This is a tentacle. It makes perfect sense to me. Tentacles can suck the life out of your enemy, give you maybe some upfront healing, maybe a little bit of heal over time, very similar to the Necromancer Death Scythe, which I talked about previously, where the initial hit, you can get a little bit of health back from that, maybe that can be applied to the base morph, Abyssal Impact. And then for Cephaliarch's Flail, maybe you get some healing over time for like 8 to 10 seconds after you cast this ability. There'd be some skill involved as well. Obviously, you have to aim it. The more enemies you hit, the more healing you get back. So I think that would be much preferable to execute damage, and it would give you a self-heal, a passive heal, fairly early on in the toolkit. A side note here on Tentacular Dread, this is more like the DPS morph. It gives you more of a debuff with the Abyssal Ink. Before the PTS, in other builds that we've tested, this used to be much stronger. It used to scale up to 20% increased damage to your enemies from the Abyssal Ink debuff for this morph specifically. I would like to see them go back to more of that damage focus. It is 11% now if you have 3 Crux. But that's another issue with this. You have to stack Crux to get the maximum debuff. It sort of takes time out of your rotation, because what you normally want to do for DPS is you want to be stacking Crux to buff your Fate Carver. Well, you can't do that. You need to first stack 3 Crux, then, cast Tentacular Dread, then stack 3 Crux again, then you can do Fate Carver. So there's a lot of wasted time, I think, in the DPS rotation, where if this just gave you the debuff automatically, if it was a builder instead of a spender, I think that would be much better. And again, I'd like to see the bonus increased a little bit from 11% now, maybe 12 to 15%, I think is the sweet spot for this skill. I know the Fate Carver Beam is another big topic of discussion for the Arcanist. You can tell that the devs are going for something unique here, with a focus on player fantasy, just feeling really strong and melting enemies in front of you, which I do like a lot. And when it works right, the Fate Carver Beam is absolutely amazing, but again, I think there are some unneeded frustrations here that can be fixed. And for one thing, the beam is easily interrupted, meaning that depending on the situation, it's extremely easy to just build up 3 stacks of Crux to empower your beam, start your cast, and then get CC'd right away, wasting not only your skill, but also the 2 to 3 seconds you spent before just building up your Crux to prepare for that beam. This is not fun at all when it happens, and it's frustrating considering this is the main damage mechanic of the Arcanist. Now, obviously, this doesn't just affect newer players either. It's going to affect players at all levels and types of content, even PvP builds where your one main damage skill, the focus of the class, is going to be useless in some cases, especially against more experienced players, as the skill is so easy to shut down. The morphs of Fate Carver don't do the skill any favors either, as they are pretty lackluster. I mean, one gives you a snare, the other one gives you cost reduction, and honestly, neither of these is very good. I personally would love to see something here where one morph makes the beam harder to interrupt, maybe at the cost of lower damage, while another morph could possibly refund some Crux if the beam was interrupted or you had to end it early. Basically, anything would be an improvement here. This skill seems really iconic and important for the class identity to the Arcanist, so the morphs really need to do more to make the skill less frustrating and more useful in a wider range of content. And finally, I do think that the Arcanist class could also greatly benefit from a stronger class dot. So here's the current best class dot, I guess, the Fulminating Rune. Imperfect Rune is the base skill. Unfortunately, this just is not super impressive. It is AoE to start, so you can put this rune on multiple enemies. It will then stick on them, so it's kind of like a sticky dot and an AoE dot combined, which is not bad, but the damage just is not good enough. The Arcanist class would really benefit from a more powerful class-based dot, something almost like the Dragon Knight Venom Claw skill, something that ramps up the damage a little bit the longer you have it successfully on a target, because this skill is just not great. It hits like a wet noodle, basically. There is something conceptually here that I think is good, especially with this morph where the rune lingers on the target for 6 seconds and then detonates. One of the others, another big issue that I'm not going to have time to talk about in this video is Arcanist PvP and sort of that lack of a burst skill. If they just tweak this rune slightly where it had the ramping dot, but also maybe the more damage you do with Arcanist class skills, if you do enough damage, maybe you can get this to explode early, something like Templar Power of the Light or like Sorcerer Haunting Curse, having this dot applied to a target and then being able to hit them with damage, ramp it up, and then have it explode as a secondary source of burst. I think that could help a lot for the Arcanist toolkit in terms of, PvP builds and being able to burst down the target, because right now you just have the beam, and like we said, the beam has issues. Hopefully they do fix some of those as well. But now I'm curious what you guys have to say about the Arcanist. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Do you think changes to healing and damage are needed like I've suggested? Do you have different suggestions? And who knows, maybe the developers will see this video and improvements will be made. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, make sure to crush that like button, and I will see you around in the next video.